The screaming lake. The shrieks begin. The first time I heard the shrieks, I thought it was an animal. Maybe a coyote or a wounded bird. It was one of those moonless nights where the darkness pressed down like a heavy weight, smothering the light from our campfire. My friends, Eric and Mallory, froze mid-conversation. We exchanged uneasy glances as the piercing cry echoed across the campground. It sounded almost human, but distorted, like someone screaming underwater. The 4 other campsites scattered around the lake went silent. The faint rustle of sleeping bags and murmured reassurances drifted through the night air, but the shrieking continued, growing louder, closer. Just the wind, Eric muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. His nonchalance didn't fool anyone. Mallory hugged her knees. That doesn't sound like the wind. The shriek faded into an unsettling silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Somewhere far across the water, I thought I saw a ripple, but it was too dark to be sure. You're both just freaked out because it's so dark, Eric said, though he didn't meet our eyes. Nothing's out there, but something about the way his voice shook made my skin crawl. Ripples in the water. The next day, the 3 of us stood at the edge of Lake Talus. It was eerily still, the surface like a sheet of glass, reflecting the surrounding forest and the leaden sky above. No birds chirped. No fish broke the surface. It was dead quiet, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. I'm telling you, it was probably just an echo, Eric said, skipping a stone across the water. The ripples spread out in perfect, concentric circles, disrupting the unnatural stillness. Mallory shivered. Echoes don't sound like someone drowning. Eric, I didn't say anything. I was too busy staring at the lake, where something shiny caught my eye. Just beneath the surface, a faint glimmer flickered and disappeared. Did you see that? I asked, pointing. Eric squinted. See what? There was something under the water. Shiny. Mallory backed away. I don't like this. Let's just stick to hiking and leave the lake alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us from beneath that mirror-like surface. The stranger's warning. That evening, a man wandered into our campsite just as the sun dipped below the horizon. He was wiry, with graying hair and a face etched with deep lines. His clothes were frayed, and he carried a lantern that flickered weakly in the encroaching darkness. You kids camping out here tonight? He asked, his voice gravelly. Eric stood up, tense. Yeah. Why? The man glanced toward the lake. You hear the screams last night? Mallory froze. You heard them too? He nodded, his expression grim. I live up in the hills. Heard them for years. Never gets easier. What are they? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man set his lantern down and crouched near the fire. This lake ain't right, he said. They call it the Drowned Lake, though no one knows how it got that name. Old folks say the water's cursed. Claims the souls of the dead can't move on. On moonless nights, they try to break through. Mallory hugged herself. That's just an old story, right? The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood, grabbed his lantern, and started walking away. Over his shoulder, he called, "Don't go near the water tonight. And if you hear the shrieks, don't follow them." Voices on the wind. We tried to laugh off the man's warning, but his words stuck with us as night fell. The firelight seemed weaker, the shadows pressing closer. None of us mentioned the shrieks, though we were all waiting for them to start. Around midnight, the first scream shattered the stillness. It was louder than the night before, drawn out and agonized. Mallory grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Ignore it," Eric whispered, though he was pale as a ghost. But then came the voices, whispered, faint at first, carried on the breeze. They seemed to rise from the lake, growing louder, more insistent. "Help me, please, I'm drowning. Save us." I clapped my hands over my ears, but the voices slipped through like water through cracks. Eric stared wide-eyed at the lake, where faint ripples marred the surface. "They're coming from the water," he murmured. Mallory started crying. "We need to leave. Now." But something about the voices rooted me in place. They sounded so desperate, so human. "We have to check it out," I said, my own voice trembling. Eric and Mallory stared at me like I was insane, but I couldn't shake the compulsion. Something in the lake needed us. The first glimpse. We approached the lake hesitantly, flashlights in hand. The whispers grew louder with each step, blending into an eerie chorus. The beam of my flashlight swept across the water, and my heart nearly stopped. Just below the surface, faces stared back at us. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, mouths open in silent screams. They pressed against the underside of the water as though it were a glass barrier, their hands clawing upward. The lake rippled faintly, distorting their features into grotesque masks. Mallory screamed and stumbled back. Eric froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. What the hell is this?" he stammered. I couldn't speak. The faces were everywhere, hundreds of them, swirling beneath the surface like a slow-moving current. And then, as if they sensed us, their movements became frantic. Hands pounded against the water. Mouths moved in soundless pleas. Suddenly, one of the faces lunged upward. A pale, rotted hand broke the surface, fingers curling toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mallory's arm. We sprinted back to the campsite, the whispers now a deafening roar behind us. The grasping hand. Back at the campsite, we were shaking too hard to speak. The fire had burned low, casting faint, flickering light over our pale faces. Mallory's hands trembled as she clutched her knees, rocking slightly. "I saw it," she whispered. "The hand. It almost grabbed me." Eric nodded, his voice barely audible. What were those things? People? Ghosts?" I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, replaying the sight of those faces, their desperate eyes, the hand breaching the surface. I felt cold, like the chill of the lake had seeped into my bones. Then we heard it, a soft, wet sound. It was coming from the edge of the campsite. Slowly, we turned our flashlights toward the sound. A trail of wet footprints, glistening faintly, led from the direction of the lake. They stopped just short of the fire, as though whatever made them was watching us from the shadows. Eric grabbed a heavy branch from the fire pit, holding it like a weapon. "We need to leave. Now!" But before we could move, the shrieking began again. This time, it wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from the forest behind us. The shadows in the trees. We spun toward the sound, flashlights sweeping wildly through the dense trees. Shadows danced across the gnarled trunks, and the shrieking grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was surrounding us. Mallory clutched my arm. "What's happening?" Eric pointed his flashlight into the woods, his knuckles white around the branch. "There's something out there." The beam caught movement, something tall and gaunt slipping between the trees, too fast to see clearly. It moved in jerky, unnatural bursts, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. My stomach turned as I realized it was dripping water, leaving dark stains on the bark it brushed past. The shrieking stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, "Join us." Mallory screamed, and Eric swung his branch at empty air. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice cracking, but there was nothing to fight. The thing, whatever it was, had disappeared, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the faint whisper of the lake. The pull of the lake. We decided to pack up and leave immediately. It didn't matter that it was the middle of the night, that the forest was pitch black, or that we had to hike several miles back to the car. We couldn't stay, not with whatever was lurking in the lake and the woods. As we hurriedly stuffed our gear into our packs, the whispers returned, faint but persistent. "Help us, save us, join us." The voices seemed to rise from everywhere, but I couldn't help noticing they were loudest near the lake. I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The water was no longer still. It churned and bubbled as if something massive was rising from its depths. And then I felt it. A tug, faint but insistent, like invisible hands pulling me toward the shore. I can't move," I whispered. Eric and Mallory turned to me, their faces pale. "What are you talking about?" Eric asked. I think it wants me. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body leaning slightly toward the water. The pull grew stronger, and I had to grab a nearby tree to keep from stumbling forward. Eric grabbed my arm, yanking me back. We're leaving. Now. But even as he pulled me away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the lake was calling me, demanding I come closer. The lost camper. Our hike back to the car was a nightmare. The narrow trail twisted through dense woods, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Every sound, a snapping twig, a rustling leaf, made us jump. Mallory clung to my arm, her flashlight beam shaking so badly it barely lit the ground in front of us. Then we found the tent. It was pitched haphazardly in a small clearing, its fabric sagging as though it had been abandoned for years. The campsite around it was a mess. Scattered clothes, a rusted lantern, and a cooler tipped on its side. Hello, Eric called out, his voice trembling. No answer. Cautiously, I stepped closer, peering inside the tent. My stomach churned. The sleeping bag was soaked, dark stains spreading across the fabric, and the air reeked of rot and mildew. A single boot sat near the entrance, its laces trailing in the mud. Someone was here, I said, stepping back. Mallory pointed to the edge of the clearing. What's that? A trail of wet footprints led away from the tent, back toward the lake. Dragged back, the footprints were fresh, glistening in the dim beam of our flashlights. They were too large to belong to a single person, the spacing too wide and uneven. They led into the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush. We're not following that, Mallory said firmly, her voice trembling. Eric agreed. We need to keep moving. The car's not far. But before we could take another step, the shrieking returned, this time deafeningly loud. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, reverberating through the forest. My head throbbed, and I dropped to my knees, clamping my hands over my ears. Through the noise, I saw movement in the trees. Shadowy figures swayed between the trunks, their watery bodies rippling unnaturally. Hands reached out from the darkness, clawing at the air, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. Suddenly, something cold and slimy wrapped around my ankle, yanking me backward. I screamed, clawing at the ground as the unseen force dragged me toward the lake. Eric and Mallory grabbed my arms, pulling me back with all their strength. For a moment, I thought the lake would win. The pull was overwhelming, like a riptide dragging me under. But with one final tug, they freed me, and we stumbled backward, gasping for air. The whispers stopped. The forest fell silent. But as I looked back toward the lake, I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. The deepening darkness. We didn't stop running until we were sure the lake was far behind us. The trail seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember from the hike in. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Mallory was sobbing quietly, her flashlight flickering in her hand. We're going in circles, she choked out. Eric shook his head, though he didn't sound convinced. No, we're close. The car's just up ahead. But I wasn't so sure. The darkness seemed thicker now, suffocating. My flashlight barely pierced it, and the trees around us felt wrong, larger, older, as if we had wandered into another world entirely. And then I saw it, the wet footprints. They stretched across the trail in front of us, leading into the trees. My heart sank. We've been here before, I whispered. Eric cursed under his breath. No, A faint splash cut him off. It came from the direction of the lake, though we had left it far behind. Or at least we thought we had. Mallory grabbed my arm. It's pulling us back, she whispered. The ghostly campfire. The trail led us to another clearing, though this one wasn't empty. A campfire burned in the center, its flames unnaturally bright and blue. Around it sat a group of people, their faces eerily still and their eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. At first, we thought they were other campers, but as we stepped closer, I realized something was wrong. Their clothes were outdated, ragged flannel shirts and patched jeans that looked decades old. And their skin was pale, too pale, as if it hadn't seen sunlight in years. One of them turned to look at us, his neck creaking like an old door hinge. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Join us," he said, his voice hollow. The others turned in unison, their faces blank and unblinking. "Join us," they echoed, their voices blending into a haunting chant. Mallory screamed and stumbled back, pulling me with her. Eric grabbed a rock and hurled it into the fire. The flames flared violently, and the campers dissolved into wisps of smoke, leaving only the faint smell of decay. The watcher beneath. The three of us huddled together, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest was darker than ever, the shadows seeming to close in around us. "We're never getting out of here," Mallory whispered, her voice shaking. Eric tried to sound confident, but his fear was obvious. "We just need to keep moving, stick together," and the ground beneath us shifted. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, and I felt the earth tremble beneath my feet. It was subtle at first, like a distant earthquake, but then it grew stronger, more focused. And then I realized it wasn't the ground. It was coming from beneath us. Something massive was moving below, its presence pressing against the earth like a heartbeat. I could feel it, the weight of it, the sheer wrongness of it. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But before we could take a step, the ground split open. The breach, the crack in the ground widened, revealing a dark, watery void beneath us. The stench of stagnant water and decay filled the air, making us gag. From the depths of the crack, pale, bloated hands reached up, grasping at the edges. Faces emerged next, their eyes hollow and lifeless, their mouths twisted in agony. They pulled themselves up one by one, water dripping from their rotting bodies. Mallory screamed, but it was drowned out by the sound of the shrieks, so loud now that it felt like they were inside my head. "We have to go," Eric shouted, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen as I stared at the horrors climbing out of the earth. One of them turned its empty gaze toward me, its mouth moving silently before it lunged. Eric tackled me out of the way just in time. The creature's claws raked the air where I had been standing, and it let out a guttural, inhuman wail. "Get up," Eric yelled, dragging me to my feet. We ran, the creatures shrieking behind us, their wet, heavy footsteps pounding the ground. The reflection. We stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a small, stagnant pool of water. It wasn't the lake, but it felt connected to it, the same unnatural stillness radiating from its surface. As we approached, I saw my reflection in the water. But it wasn't mine, not exactly. It moved differently, its eyes too wide, its mouth slightly open in a silent scream. What is that?" Mallory whispered, staring into the water. Eric grabbed a rock and threw it into the pool, shattering the reflection. But instead of ripples, the water erupted, spraying us with icy droplets. From the pool rose a figure, its body translucent and shimmering like water. Its face was eerily familiar, my face. The reflection stared at me, its expression twisted with pain and rage. And then it spoke, its voice layered and echoing. "You should not have come here." The ground beneath us began to tremble again, and the figure lunged forward. The mirror self, the shimmering figure lunged at me with a speed I couldn't react to. Its translucent hands passed through my chest, but it wasn't painless. A wave of cold, so intense it burned, coursed through my body. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was under the water. Around me, I saw the faces of the drowned, their hollow eyes staring at me, their mouths moving in silent screams. Their hands reached out, brushing against my skin. I tried to move, but my limbs were sluggish, the water dragging me down. I could feel their desperation, their fury. And then I heard the voice again. My own voice, warped and layered, coming from the shimmering figure still standing in the clearing. "They won't let you leave." Eric's voice snapped me out of it. "Fight it," he yelled, shaking me. I gasped as the cold receded, and I fell to the ground, coughing. The figure hissed, its watery form rippling and distorting before it disappeared into the pool. The drowned's grasp. We didn't stop to question what had just happened. We ran. The forest seemed alive now, the branches clawing at us as we stumbled through the underbrush. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, blending with the faint sound of rushing water. "They're getting closer," Mallory gasped, looking over her shoulder. I risked a glance back and felt my stomach drop. The drowned were following us, their pale, bloated bodies moving with unnatural speed. Their wet, dragging footsteps echoed in the dark, and their outstretched hands glistened with lake water. Eric grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "We can't outrun them. We need to hide." But where? The forest offered no sanctuary, no safety. And then I saw it. A narrow cave entrance, hidden behind a curtain of vines. "Over there!" I shouted, pointing. We dove inside just as the drowned reached the clearing. Their shrieks echoed through the forest, piercing and angry. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't find us. But then I heard them moving closer, their wet hands scraping against the rocks outside. The cave's secret. The cave was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture. Our flashlights barely illuminated the narrow space, but we didn't dare turn them off. The whispers followed us inside, softer now but still present, like a distant echo. Mallory hugged herself, shivering. "What do we do now? We can't stay here forever." Eric was examining the walls, his flashlight beam catching strange markings etched into the stone. They were old, almost ancient, and they formed a spiral pattern that made my head spin if I stared too long. "These look familiar," Eric said, his voice uneasy. I stepped closer, my eyes tracing the symbols. They reminded me of the ripples in the lake, the way they spread out in perfect circles. And then I saw something else. A small, waterlogged journal lying in the corner of the cave. I picked it up carefully, the pages crumbling at the edges. The writing inside was smeared and faded, but one line stood out, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The water calls them back. Don't let them take you under the tunnel to the lake." The whispers grew louder, their tone changing from pleading to demanding. The cave trembled slightly, and a faint sound of rushing water echoed from deeper within. Eric shone his flashlight down the narrow tunnel that stretched further into the darkness. "I think this leads to the lake," he said. Mallory shook her head violently. "We can't go back there. Are you insane?" "We don't have a choice," Eric snapped. "They're outside. If we stay here, we're trapped. If we go forward, maybe there's a way out." Reluctantly, we followed the tunnel, the sound of water growing louder with every step. The air grew colder, and the walls began to glisten with condensation. My skin prickled as I realized the water wasn't just on the walls. It was rising. Slowly but surely, the floor of the tunnel was flooding. "We need to hurry," I said, trying to ignore the icy water soaking my shoes. And then we saw it, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't natural, more like the eerie glow of the lake at night, but it was our only option. The final pull. The tunnel opened into a cavern, and at its center was a massive pool of water. It was connected to the lake, I was sure of it. The water rippled unnaturally, glowing faintly, and the whispers were deafening now. The faces of the drowned stared up at us from beneath the surface, their expressions twisted with anger and despair. The water churned violently, and I felt the pull again, the invisible force dragging me toward the edge. "Stay back!" Mallory screamed, grabbing my arm, but it was too late. The pull was too strong, and I stumbled forward, falling to my knees at the edge of the pool. Hands reached out of the water, grabbing at me, their icy grip searing my skin. "Let him go!" Eric shouted, swinging his flashlight like a club. The beam struck one of the hands, and it recoiled with a screech. Mallory pulled me back just as the water erupted, and a massive figure rose from its depths. It was made of water, its form constantly shifting, but its face was horrifyingly human, an amalgamation of all the drowned souls. "You cannot leave," it intoned, its voice like a tidal wave. "You belong to us now." I felt the pull intensify, my body leaning toward the water despite my efforts to resist. Eric and Mallory grabbed me, their combined strength barely enough to hold me back. "Fight it!" Mallory screamed. "It's trying to take you." In a desperate act, Eric grabbed the journal from my hand and hurled it into the water. The effect was immediate. The figure screamed, its form distorting violently, and the hands released me. The water bubbled and churned, and the cavern began to collapse. "Run!" Eric yelled, dragging us back toward the tunnel. We barely made it out as the cavern caved in behind us, the shrieking fading into silence.